One of the greatest misunderstandings about empaths is the assumption that kindness is a form of weakness. People see someone who is patient, forgiving, understanding, and emotionally available, and they immediately place that person into a category that feels safe to exploit. They assume that because an empath listens instead of attacking, because they seek understanding instead of domination, because they offer grace instead of revenge, they must somehow be less powerful than everyone else in the room. But this assumption reveals something fascinating about human psychology. Many people have been conditioned to recognize only one form of strength: force. They recognize the loud voice. They recognize aggression. They recognize intimidation. They recognize the ability to make others uncomfortable. What they often fail to recognize is the strength required to remain calm when you have every reason not to be. They fail to recognize the discipline required to understand another person's pain while carrying your own. They fail to recognize the restraint required to choose compassion when retaliation would be easier. An empath often walks through life carrying an unusual burden. They notice things other people miss. They detect subtle emotional shifts. They sense tension beneath words. They see contradictions between what people say and what people actually feel. This heightened awareness can sometimes look like sensitivity from the outside, but sensitivity is not weakness. In fact, if you think about it carefully, sensitivity is often a form of advanced perception. Imagine two people entering the same room. One notices only what is obvious. The other notices the atmosphere, the discomfort, the hidden conflict, the insecurity behind someone's confidence, and the loneliness behind someone's smile. Which person is actually gathering more information? Which person is operating with greater awareness? The empaths. Challenge is that they often use this awareness in service of connection rather than control. They understand people deeply, and because they understand people deeply, they frequently give second chances where others would walk away. They see the wounded child behind the difficult adult. They see the fear behind the arrogance. They see the pain behind the anger. This creates a dangerous illusion. The people around them begin to believe that understanding means acceptance. They assume that because the empath understands their behavior, the empath approves of it. Because the empath forgives, they assume there will always be forgiveness. Because the empath stays, they assume the empath will never leave. And that is where the misunderstanding begins to become costly. What many people fail to realize is that empathy is not the absence of boundaries. It is not an inability to recognize harmful behavior. An empath often sees harmful behavior more clearly than anyone else in the room. The difference is that they spend far more time trying to understand its source before deciding how to respond. This distinction matters. Understanding someone's motives does not erase the consequences of their actions. Knowing why someone lies does not make the lie harmless. Understanding why someone manipulates does not make manipulation acceptable. Yet empaths frequently extend patience because they hope awareness will lead to change. They believe that if enough understanding is offered, growth might become possible. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. And this is where people make a fatal miscalculation. They interpret patience as permission. They interpret compassion as compliance. They interpret forgiveness as weakness. The reality is far different. The empath is often exercising enormous self-control. They are choosing not to react impulsively. They are choosing not to escalate conflict. They are choosing to remain grounded while evaluating the situation. What appears passive is frequently a highly active psychological process. In behavioral science, one of the strongest indicators of personal power is not the ability to control others. It is the ability to control yourself. Anyone can react. Anyone can lash out. Anyone can seek revenge when hurt. The far rarer skill is maintaining clarity when emotions are running high. Empaths often possess this skill to a remarkable degree. The problem is that people become accustomed to receiving its benefits without appreciating its value. They grow comfortable being understood. They grow comfortable being forgiven. They grow comfortable being given opportunities they have not earned. Eventually, They stop seeing the empath's kindness as a gift and begin treating it as an entitlement. That is when the relationship enters dangerous territory, because every empath has a limit. Every patient person has a threshold. Every compassionate individual eventually reaches a point where understanding is no longer enough to justify staying in a harmful situation. And when that moment arrives, people are often shocked, not because the empath changed, but because they finally revealed the strength that was there all along. The truth is that kindness is one of the most misunderstood forms of power in the human state. It requires awareness, discipline, courage, and emotional mastery. Weakness seeks control because it fears losing it. True strength remains kind because it never needed control in the first place. Before you mistake someone's compassion for vulnerability, ask yourself a simple question. Is their kindness a sign that they cannot hurt you, or a sign that they have chosen not to? That answer may change everything. Once you understand that an empath's kindness is not weakness, you begin to see something else that most people completely miss. Every interaction leaves an imprint. Every broken promise, every moment of disrespect, every manipulation disguised as misunderstanding creates a psychological record. And while an empath may appear forgiving on the surface, that record is being quietly maintained beneath the calm exterior. This is where people often misunderstand the nature of emotional intelligence. Many assume that emotionally aware individuals simply let things go. They imagine that because an empath doesn't immediately retaliate, confront, or create drama, the event has disappeared from their mind. But that's not how human psychology works. Emotional maturity does not erase memory. In fact, it often sharpens it. The empath remembers, not necessarily the exact words, not necessarily every detail, but they remember patterns, and patterns are what matter. Human beings are storytelling creatures. We naturally search for meaning in the behavior of others. Most people evaluate events individually. An empath tends to evaluate them collectively. They don't just see one disappointing action. They begin noticing a sequence. They notice how someone consistently reacts when challenged. They notice who disappears during difficult times. They notice who only reaches out when they need something. They notice the gap between a person's intentions and their actual behavior. Over time, these observations accumulate. Think of it like drops of water falling into a container. One drop seems insignificant. 10 drops seem harmless. 100 drops still don't look threatening. But eventually the container reaches capacity. The final drop didn't create the overflow by itself. It simply revealed what had been building all along. This is often what happens when an empath finally reaches their limit. People around them are shocked because they focus only on the last incident. The empath is responding to the entire pattern. This distinction is crucial. When someone says, "I can't believe you're upset about something so small," they're usually looking at a single event. The empath is looking at years of evidence. They're looking at 1,000 moments that communicated the same message. They're looking at repeated demonstrations of priorities, values, and character. What makes this process particularly interesting is that empaths tend to give people the benefit of the doubt longer than most. Why? Because they understand complexity. They know that people have bad days. They know that trauma influences behavior. They know that stress can make someone act in ways they later regret. They know that fear often disguises itself as anger, and insecurity often disguises itself as arrogance. This understanding makes them extraordinarily patient, but it also means that when they finally draw a conclusion about someone, that conclusion is rarely impulsive. An empath doesn't usually decide overnight that a relationship is unhealthy. They arrive there gradually. They test alternative explanations. They question their own perceptions. They search for evidence that contradicts their concerns. They look for signs of growth and accountability. In many cases, they spend more time defending the other person's behavior than the other person spends correcting it. That's why the eventual realization can be so powerful. Because when an empath finally accepts that a pattern is real, they aren't reacting emotionally. They're responding to accumulated evidence. This creates a fascinating paradox. The person causing the harm often believes the empath is overly emotional because the final response appears emotional. In reality, The empath may be acting from one of the most rational conclusions they've ever reached. They've simply gathered enough data. Psychologically speaking, trust operates much like a bank account. Positive experiences create deposits. Broken promises create withdrawals. Honesty builds balance. Deception reduces it. Respect adds value. Disrespect removes it. The mistake many people make is assuming that trust automatically regenerates after every withdrawal. It doesn't. Trust is built through consistency. And consistency is exactly what empaths observe. This is why repeated small betrayals can become more damaging than a single dramatic one. The dramatic betrayal is obvious. The small betrayals often go unnoticed by everyone except the empath. They're hidden in dismissive comments, forgotten commitments, broken boundaries, subtle manipulations, and repeated failures to take responsibility. Individually, they seem minor. Collectively, they reveal character. Eventually, the empath reaches a moment of clarity, not anger, not revenge. Clarity. And clarity changes everything. Because once a person clearly sees a pattern, they can no longer pretend it isn't there. The explanations that once felt convincing lose their power. The excuses become repetitive. The hope that sustained the relationship begins to compete with reality. This is often the stage where people start sensing distance from the empath. The empath isn't becoming cold. They're becoming accurate. They're no longer investing energy into the version of someone they hoped existed. They're beginning to respond to the person consistently revealed through behavior. That shift is profound, because behavior is truth in motion. Words can be rehearsed. Intentions can be exaggerated. Promises can be made endlessly. But behavior has a way of exposing what a person genuinely values. And empaths, perhaps more than anyone else, eventually learn to trust what they repeatedly observe. So if you find yourself in the presence of someone who continues offering patience, understanding, and grace, don't mistake it for blindness. They see far more than they say. They notice far more than they reveal. And every action is contributing to a story being written in their mind. The question is simple. If someone judged your character, not by your promises but by your patterns, what story would your behavior tell? That answer is shaping every relationship you have, whether you realize it or not. After enough evidence has accumulated, after enough patterns have revealed themselves, something begins to change inside the empath. And this is the stage that almost nobody recognizes when it's happening. In fact, it is often mistaken for the exact opposite of what it really is. Most people expect a breaking point to be loud. They expect anger. They expect arguments. They expect emotional confrontations, dramatic exits, or long speeches explaining every hurt and disappointment. Popular culture has conditioned us to believe that when someone reaches their limit, there must be some visible explosion that announces it to the world. But with an empath, the most important shift is often silent. They stop explaining themselves. At first, this seems insignificant. After all, everyone gets tired of repeating themselves from time to time. But psychologically, this moment carries enormous meaning, because explaining is an investment. Every explanation is an attempt to build understanding. Every difficult conversation is evidence that someone still believes the relationship can improve. When an empath repeatedly communicates their needs, their concerns, their boundaries, and their feelings, they are doing something many people overlook. They are extending hope. Hope says, if I explain this clearly enough, maybe things can change. Hope says, if you understand how this affects me, perhaps you'll make a different choice. Hope says, I still believe there is something here worth protecting. This is why empaths often spend far longer in unhealthy dynamics than outsiders think they work. From the outside, it appears irrational. From the inside, it feels like loyalty. It feels like commitment. It feels like refusing to abandon someone before giving them every reasonable opportunity to grow. But eventually a realization emerges. Not every person is confused. Not every person lacks understanding. Not every hurtful behavior is the result of ignorance. Sometimes people understand perfectly well. They simply prioritize differently. This realization can be profoundly unsettling because it forces the empath to confront a difficult truth. The issue may not be communication. The issue may not be misunderstanding. The issue may be that the other person values comfort more than accountability, convenience more than connection, or control more than mutual respect. And once that possibility becomes undeniable, something shifts. The empath stops trying to convince. They stop trying to justify. They stop trying to make someone see what they have repeatedly chosen not to see. This is often the moment when the other person becomes confused. Ironically, they frequently notice the empath's silence long before they notice the empath's pain. They ask questions like, "What's wrong?" Or, "Why are you acting differently?" Or, "Perhaps you've changed." But what they're really noticing is not a change. They're noticing the absence of effort they had grown accustomed to receiving. The empath is no longer carrying the emotional labor of the relationship alone, and that can feel shocking to people who unconsciously depended on it. There's an important psychological principle at work here. Human beings tend to value what they are at risk of losing. As long as something feels guaranteed, its importance fades into the background. The empath's patience, understanding, and willingness to repair conflict often become invisible, precisely because they have been available for so long. The silence changes that. Suddenly, the emotional safety net begins to disappear. Suddenly, the person who always initiated reconciliation stops reaching out. The person who always explained their perspective stops explaining. The person who always fought for the relationship stops fighting. And this is where many people make another critical mistake. They interpret the empath's silence as weakness, withdrawal, or emotional exhaustion. Sometimes exhaustion is part of it. But more often, something deeper is occurring. Detachment. Not bitterness. Not hatred. Detachment. There is an enormous difference between those states. Bitterness keeps you emotionally connected to the source of your pain. Hatred still requires energy. Resentment still demands attention. Detachment, however, is something else entirely. It is the gradual recognition that your peace matters more than winning an argument. The empath begins redirecting energy inward. Instead of analyzing another person's behavior, they start examining their own choices. Instead of asking, "How can I make them understand?" they begin asking, "Why have I accepted so little for so long?" This question changes everything, because personal transformation rarely begins with changing someone else. It begins with seeing yourself clearly. The empath starts recognizing how often they confused potential with reality, how often they gave credit for intentions instead of actions, how often they prioritized someone else's healing while neglecting their own. And as this awareness grows, their need for external validation begins to fade. They no longer require agreement to trust their perception. They no longer require apologies to validate their experience. They no longer require closure from someone unwilling to provide it. This is a level of psychological freedom that many people never achieve, because true freedom arrives when your peace is no longer dependent on another person's cooperation. The empath starts understanding that closure is not something another person gives you. Closure is something you create when you accept reality without demanding that reality become different. That acceptance can appear quiet from the outside, but internally, it is revolutionary. It marks the end of chasing, convincing, proving, and pleading. It marks the beginning of self-respect. And once an empath reaches this stage, the relationship has already changed in ways that cannot easily be reversed. Because the person who once invested endless energy into maintaining the connection is now investing that energy into themselves. Remember this. When an empath stops explaining themselves, it is rarely because they have nothing left to say. It is because they have finally realized that understanding cannot be forced. The moment you stop trying to make others see your worth is often the moment you begin seeing it yourself. Once an empath reaches the point of genuine detachment, something remarkable begins to happen. This is the part of the story that most people never anticipate. They assume that if an empath stops investing in a relationship, they will become bitter, cynical, or emotionally closed off. They imagine the loss will permanently damage the very qualities that made the empath special in the first place. But that is rarely what happens. In fact, what comes next is often the beginning of the empath's most powerful transformation. To understand why, you have to recognize where an empath's energy has been going all this time. For months, years, or sometimes even decades, a significant portion of their mental and emotional resources may have been directed toward understanding, supporting, rescuing, or accommodating other people. They have been analyzing conversations, managing tensions, anticipating emotional needs, and trying to maintain harmony. That level of emotional labor is expensive. Most people never see the cost because it happens internally. There is no visible invoice, no public record. But every act of emotional investment requires attention, time, and psychological energy. And when an empath finally stops pouring that energy into people who consistently fail to value it, they suddenly find themselves in possession of something they haven't had in a very long time. Capacity. Mental capacity, emotional capacity, creative capacity. For the first time, their energy belongs to them. This is why the transformation can appear so dramatic to outside observers. The person who once seemed exhausted becomes focused. The person who appeared uncertain becomes decisive. The person who spent years questioning themselves begins trusting their instincts. People often mistake this shift for a personality change. It isn't. It's a resource reallocation. The empath is no longer spending the majority of their emotional bandwidth managing someone else's behavior. And once that happens, growth accelerates. Psychologically speaking, awareness is one of the most valuable human assets. Empaths already possess a high degree of awareness. The challenge is that much of it has traditionally been directed outward. They have become experts at reading others, while sometimes neglecting themselves. After detachment, that awareness begins turning inward, and this is where real transformation begins. The empath starts asking different questions. Not, how do I keep this relationship together, but, what do I actually want from my life? Not, why won't they change, but, what patterns within me allowed this dynamic to continue? Not, how can I earn more appreciation, but, why did I believe appreciation had to be earned in the first place? These questions are uncomfortable. They require honesty. They require self-examination. But they also create freedom, because every meaningful transformation starts when a person becomes curious about their own participation in their circumstances. Notice the distinction here. The empath is no longer focused on blame. Blame keeps attention trapped in the past. Growth redirects attention toward the future. This shift creates a fascinating effect. The same emotional intelligence that once helped them understand other people now begins helping them understand themselves. They become aware of unconscious patterns, hidden fears, and old beliefs that quietly shape their decisions. Many discover they were operating from a scarcity mindset without realizing it. They feared losing connection. They feared disappointing others. They feared being misunderstood or abandoned. And because of those fears, they tolerated situations that conflicted with their deeper values. But once those fears are confronted, something changes. Boundaries stop feeling selfish. Boundaries start feeling necessary. This is one of the most misunderstood concepts in modern psychology. People often think boundaries are walls, designed to keep others out. In reality, healthy boundaries are filters. They help determine who has access to your time, energy, trust, and emotional investment. The transformed empath begins understanding this intuitively. They no longer feel obligated to explain every boundary. They no longer feel guilty for protecting their peace. They no longer confuse access with love. And perhaps most importantly, they develop a new relationship with discernment. Discernment is different from judgment. Judgment says, everyone is dangerous. Discernment says, I can recognize the difference between healthy and unhealthy behavior. This distinction matters because true healing does not make an empath harder. It makes them wiser. They remain compassionate. They remain caring. They remain capable of deep connection. But now those qualities are guided by clarity rather than hope alone. They stop falling in love with potential. They start paying attention to consistency. They stop rewarding promises. they start valuing actions. And this creates a level of personal power that many people find difficult to understand, because the transformed empath no longer needs validation from those who once withheld it. Their confidence becomes internal rather than external. Their worth becomes self-defined rather than relationship-defined. Their peace becomes something they protect rather than something they negotiate. Ironically, this is often the stage when people who underestimated them begin paying attention. They notice the newfound confidence. They notice the emotional stability. They notice the absence of desperation. What they are witnessing is not revenge. It is evolution. The empath has taken the pain, confusion, and disappointment that once weighed them down and converted it into wisdom. And wisdom is one of the few things in life that cannot be taken away once it has been earned. So when an empath finally lets go of what was breaking them, don't assume they are losing something valuable. More often than not, they are reclaiming something they should never have surrendered in the first place. The greatest transformation begins the moment you stop asking others to recognize your worth and start living as if you already know it. And this brings us to the final part of the story, the part that gives this entire discussion its weight. Because after the empath has stopped explaining, after they have detached, after they have redirected their energy toward growth and self-respect, something happens that many people never expect. The people who took them for granted begin to feel the absence. Not immediately. That's important to understand. Regret rarely arrives at the moment of loss. In most cases, it arrives later, when the noise has faded and reality has had time to settle in. Human beings are remarkably skilled at overlooking what they have while it is present. Familiarity has a strange effect on perception. The more consistently something is available, the less consciously we tend to appreciate it. This is one of the great paradoxes of human nature. People often notice the value of a bridge only after it collapses. They notice the value of their health after illness. They notice the value of trust after betrayal. And they notice the value of an empath after the empath is gone. What makes this particularly powerful is that most empaths don't advertise what they provide. They don't walk into a relationship announcing the emotional labor they perform every day. They don't create invoices for their patients. They don't keep score publicly. Much of what they contribute happens quietly. They remember details. They offer support without being asked. They create emotional safety. They listen when others need to be heard. They absorb tension to keep peace. They give people room to make mistakes. Because these contributions are subtle, they are easy to overlook, until they disappear. Then suddenly the absence becomes impossible to ignore. The person who once felt deeply understood realizes how rare genuine understanding actually is. The person who always had someone willing to listen discovers that attentive listening is far less common than they imagined. The person who benefited from endless patience encounters others who enforce boundaries much sooner, and a comparison begins to form. Not because the empath is trying to prove a point, but because reality is doing it automatically. Psychologically, we evaluate experiences through contrast. We often don't recognize the quality of something until we experience its absence. This is why regret can feel so intense. It is the collision between what we assumed would always be available and what is no longer accessible. Many people spend years believing the empath will always be there. After all, they were there before. They forgave before. They stayed before. They understood before. Why would this time be different? But what they fail to recognize is that every relationship operates on invisible foundations. Trust, respect, appreciation, reciprocity. These are not dramatic concepts, but they determine whether a connection survives. When those foundations are repeatedly neglected, the relationship may continue physically, long after it has begun collapsing psychologically. The empath often sees this collapse long before anyone else does. That's why their departure can seem sudden to the other person, even though it was years in the making. The final goodbye may take a moment. The decision took much longer. And once that decision is fully formed, something changes that many people struggle to accept. The empath doesn't leave merely because they are hurt. They leave because they have learned. This distinction matters. Pain alone does not always create change. Human beings can tolerate astonishing amounts of pain when they believe it serves a purpose. What creates transformation is not pain itself. It is understanding. The empath eventually understands that loyalty without reciprocity becomes self-abandonment. They understand that compassion without boundaries becomes self-neglect. They understand that loving someone should never require the permanent sacrifice of self-respect. Once these lessons become integrated, returning to the old dynamic becomes increasingly difficult. Not because they no longer care, but because they finally care about themselves too. And this is often where regret becomes unavoidable for the people who underestimated them. Because they are not losing the same empath who once tolerated everything. That version no longer exists. The transformation changed them. The growth changed them. The lessons changed them. The person who emerges from that process still possesses kindness, empathy, and compassion. But those qualities are now protected by wisdom. And wisdom is far harder to manipulate than innocence. This is why so many people find themselves looking back and wondering what happened. What happened is simple. They confused availability with permanence. They assumed patience had no limit. They assumed understanding required acceptance. They assumed forgiveness guaranteed access. And they discovered too late that none of those assumptions were true. The deepest regret is rarely losing someone's attention. It is losing someone's trust. Attention can be regained. Trust is much harder, especially when it was broken by a pattern rather than a single mistake. Because patterns reveal priorities, and priorities reveal character. In the end, the empath's greatest lesson is not about revenge, punishment, or proving anyone wrong. It is about recognizing value before it disappears. Every relationship presents that opportunity. Every conversation, every promise, every act of respect contributes to the future of that connection. The tragedy is that many people wait until the relationship is gone before they begin behaving, as if it mattered. So if there is one thing worth remembering, it is this. Never assume that someone's kindness guarantees their presence. The people who understand you, support you, forgive you, and stand beside you are among the rarest gifts life offers. Appreciate them while they are still there, because the moment an empath learns their worth, the opportunity to take them for granted may be gone forever.